Tonight on Talking Politics, Governor Maura Healey is out with some new proposals to cut and spend taxes in the state. Do her plans live up to the promises she made on the campaign trail? We'll discuss ahead. But first, we have long known that climate change is coming for Boston's coastline. For years, scientific reports have shown us just how much the city and the state will end up underwater if we don't take major action and fast. The good news, there are a lot of ideas out there about how to protect against rising seas. But as a rule, they aren't cheap. That includes a proposal for a floodgate in Fort Point Channel with movable barriers that would block off the harbor during major storms so stormwater from other Boston neighborhoods could drain into it instead of getting backed up and causing massive flooding elsewhere. But as John Chieppo points out in the Boston Globe, right now that floodgate has an eye-popping price tag in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and no one seems especially eager to line up to foot the bill. John, a business and politics reporter for the Globe, joins me now, as does Joan Fitzgerald. She's a professor in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Northeastern University and the lead researcher on the inaugural Boston Climate Progress Report for the Boston Foundation. She argued in a recent Globe op-ed that Massachusetts needs a new statewide agency to manage projects like these and to make sure that future mitigation efforts don't cause more problems than they solve. John Chieppo, Joan Fitzgerald, thank you both for being here. So, John, the project in Fort Point Channel, the proposed project, is the brainchild of John Sullivan, the chief engineer at the Boston Water and Sewer Commission. Can you explain it in the simplest terms possible? Because it took me more time than I would have expected to wrap my brain around it.
I'm going to try to. He wants to turn the Fort Point Channel, which rises and falls by at least 10 feet during low tide and high tide, into a sort of bathtub at low tide that can store all the rainwater that comes in. So it's
from elsewhere, right?
Yes, it's a nexus point for drain pipes from all over crucial parts of the city, in downtown, South Boston, Dorchester, South End. A lot of that rainwater flows right into Fort Point Channel. And, John Sullivan was actually sitting at the Barking Crab one day looking out at the Fort Point Channel, noticed the tide was really low and thought, oh, maybe I could store some rainwater there. But in order to do it, he needs to have gates that'll shut the Fort Point Channel at low tide, yep. And then there'll be room to kind of the difference, which is, millions and millions of gallons of rainwater you could store there. The idea is if you don't store that water and it's high tide and the storm comes in, a really bad storm, and he would only do this or it would be someone else because he's on his 51st year in the agency. But Boston Water and Sewer or whoever runs this would only do it in a really bad storm. That storm would push against all that rainwater coming out, and then it would back up and flood hundreds of acres.
We've got a couple artist renderings that I want to show really quick, in part just because I think artist renderings of this stuff tend to be cool. First, we have an image of a possible design for the floodgates. In this particular image that you're looking at right here, it's combined with the Northern Avenue Bridge, which may or may not get built, but you see those gates on the bottom, they're open right there, could be closed by a couple alternate mechanisms, as you said, at low tide. And then the other image I want to show, you were talking about flooding in a cataclysmic storm. On the left there, we have one projection for a cataclysmic storm in which this floodgate does not exist. You see red flooding, stormwater backed up all around the center of Boston. And then the image on the right is diminished flooding with stormwater not being backed up as badly if these gates were built. So that drives home, that helps, I think, visualize some of the points that you raised. Really quickly, before we get to Joan, would this also protect the seaport from flooding?
I would protect a lot of the seaport. Basically, any of the, because the seaport's right there on Fort Point Channel. Some of that area does drain in. Mm-hmm. In fact, if you remember that dumpster, that floating down Congress Street, yeah. I think, one of those seaport roads, I think that was probably rainwater, not ocean water. So, I mean, the seaport's definitely affected by rainwater flooding.
A benefit for that neighborhood, too. Okay, Joan Fitzgerald, in that Boston Globe op-ed, you and your co-authors, Julie Wormser and Jonathan LaMontagne, argued that Massachusetts needs a new coastal adaptation agency. Can you explain why it doesn't make sense or why it isn't enough to let individual communities like Boston, Revere, Everett, other places south of the city, why not let individual coastal communities come up with their own individual solutions?
Well, I think the first and most important reason is that nature ignores political boundaries. And so when you have coastal flooding, it's not just going to occur on the Boston coastline. It's going to affect the whole harbor. It's going to affect the whole state's coastline. And so when we look at what happens when cities and towns are forced to address that individually, some cities have more ability to do so, but even Boston, you know, as we just heard, we're talking hundreds of millions. And so there's Joe Moakley Park that employs both hard structures and nature-based solutions, millions of dollars to put into that. And so there's a disparity in what Everett or Chelsea can afford to do and what Boston can afford to do. Then there's the possibility of what one community does affects the other community. And so by having a statewide agency that's prioritizing the most vulnerable spots, and also examining systems like the T, Logan Airport, and so forth, you get a much more comprehensive and effective solution.
And just to draw out a point that you just touched on, it's possible that, for example, if Boston took a particular step, that there could be a negative effect on nearby communities, right? Something that's good for Boston proper might not help the communities to the north or south on the coast. Is that right?
Well, we don't know that for sure, and It depends on the type of solution being employed, and that would be part of what a state agency could examine.
Okay, Joan, another question for you. Governor Healey made a big point early in her tenure of creating a new climate chief position tasked with coordinating the state's response to climate change across multiple agencies. If Melissa Hoffer, who Healey tapped for this post, does her job right, what would a new agency provide that Hoffer, acting alone, could not?
Well, I think Hoffer could be definitely part of that and lead that. But I think what has to happen is there has to be some kind of process where the coastal communities are weighing in, where the MBTA is part of it, Logan Airport. So there has to be more input in the planning process. And that could be organized in a number of ways. In this, we hit upon the idea of a state agency kind of basing it on what happened with the cleanup of Boston Harbor. And so the MWRA was created for that. It and had a special division that was its whole job. And then that was dismantled when it was done. And then maybe at that point, it could go back under the climate czar.
Got it. John, the plan that John Sullivan is putting out there, as Joan just mentioned, is not cheap. When you wrote about it a couple years ago, I think the price tag was somewhere in maybe a couple $100 million.
It's gone up now that he's got engineers actually looking at it.
Yeah, now you have the most impressive iteration is, I think, $750 million, kind of drifting up toward that $1 billion mark. When it comes to Boston stakeholders, who is intrigued or interested in supporting Sullivan's plan, and who's balking at it?
Well, you know, he has been going around, and I would say that there isn't anyone that's been blocking it. You know, the mayor.
She didn't sound too excited.
No, she would love to see what she says nature-based solutions, which means using wetlands or hills and berms to kind of prevent bad flooding. But the reality is you're going to need a mix. And the Charles River Watershed Association actually seems very intrigued, and they tend to prefer nature-based solutions as well. They are like, yeah, let's get this going because we got to put both on the table. And the big question, and it's a question that Joan brought up, is should we be bringing in other cities? You know, John Sullivan is at Boston Water and Sewer, so he looked at, you know, he didn't just look at Fort Point Channel, he looked at other parts of the city, but he looked at East Boston and Charlestown. But what about Everett and Chelsea, which are sort of right across the water from those places? We need to get them involved in the conversation too.
Joan, the project that we've been talking about here, as we just mentioned, is not cheap. I'm wondering how much you think the state needs to be ready to spend in the coming years to do climate adaptation and protect coastal communities. What sort of price tag should people have in mind?
I don't think anyone has the exact answer to that. I mean, the cost for Boston alone is estimated to be about $1.7 billion to $3 billion. So depending on what's needed in the other communities. So I couldn't tell you an exact price, but I can tell you how limited the available funding is. So, for example, as we talked about with FEMA building resilient infrastructure, that's $50 million a year. It's competitive. It's hard to apply for. So there will have to be some dedicated funding stream. And I think that's one of the first things the state agency would have to do is just figure out how much money we're talking about.
Given the numbers that we're talking about here, I have to say I wonder what the political appetite would be, because people don't like to come up with new revenue sources for new funding streams. I'm not saying, I mean, it seems like there's a huge need, but I do wonder how it would go over at the State House. John, in the business world, which you cover, do you think there might be an appetite for the kind of solution that Joan and her colleagues floated?
I think there's an appetite for, yes, I do think there'd be an appetite for an agency. Maybe it's statewide, maybe it's like the MWRA, which is really Boston Harbor specific or Massachusetts Bay specific. You know, something that can actually borrow money so that you don't have to write a check up front. You know, a bonding authority like the MWRA would be really helpful in this situation.
Joan, a lot of Massachusetts is nowhere near the coast. And I can imagine a viewer watching this conversation, say, who lives in the Worcester area, and thinking, you know, if you're a developer who decided to build in the seaport, or if you're a condo owner who bought on the waterfront in East Boston because you like the view, you made those choices freely. I shouldn't be expected to be part of footing the bill for decisions you made that in retrospect look like they weren't the right ones to make. What would you say to that kind of hypothetical objection or skepticism?
Well, I would say a couple of things. First, it may be that it would be Massachusetts Bay, that it be a more regional organization under the executive office supervising it. I think John's point that it has to have bonding authority is critical in terms of funding it. But there are stormwater problems. There are problems throughout the state. So I can understand Western Massachusetts may not be as invested, but I think as a state in terms of highways, roads, and so forth, that protecting that Boston, harbor is particularly important for the whole state. But to the property owner element of this, there definitely is room for public-private partnerships in funding these initiatives.
Are there examples of other states taking the sort of step that you and your co-authors suggested in the op-ed? Is anyone doing this elsewhere right now?
The state that I thought that had an interesting example is Maryland, where the state legislature granted designation of regional authorities, and they had both bonding and they also had private sector solutions that provided benefits to the city. And I thought it's in the report. We discussed that at length as an alternative approach that would be more regional in nature.
All right, I think we have to leave it there. Joan Fitzgerald and John Chesto, thank you both. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Next up, when it comes to governing, it was Maura Healey's biggest week yet. On Monday at a YMCA in Lynn, Healey unveiled a sprawling tax cut plan totaling nearly $750 million, bigger than the one former Governor Charlie Baker pushed unsuccessfully last year. As Governor Healey noted in her remarks, her plan contains a wide array of proposals aimed at everyone from residents of low or limited means to higher earners who might be thinking about taking their talents elsewhere.
Everywhere we go, the lieutenant governor and I hear about the cost of living and how it's impacting communities, how it's skyrocketing past people. The young mom who wants to return to her dream job but can't afford childcare. The recent college grad who can't make both his rent and his student loan payments. The senior who wants to stay in the home where they raise their family but can't keep up with property taxes. The small business owner contemplating moving to another state that has less burdensome taxes.
That tax plan is a centerpiece of Healey's first ever state budget proposal, which she released on Wednesday. That blueprint totals $55.5 billion. In addition to cutting taxes, the governor wants to ramp up spending on the environment and energy, let some adults 25 and older go to community college for free, and allow inmates in the Massachusetts Department of Correction system to make free phone calls. For a look at how Governor Healey's budget squares with candidate Healey's campaign promises and vision, and what it tells us about her still evolving political identity, I'm joined by Lisa Kashinsky, the author of Politico's Massachusetts Playbook, Charlie Chieppo of the Pioneer Institute, and Phineas Baxandall of the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center. Thank you all for being here. Charlie, Pioneer has, by the standards of Massachusetts politics, a more conservative take on budgetary matters and other matters. What did Pioneer like and what didn't you like in terms of what you heard from Healey this week?
Well, I think there was a lot to like. I think that, she has been talking a lot about affordability, and I think she made significant progress on affordability with many of the things that she did. I think that affordability is different from competitiveness, and I think that there was some good moves toward making Massachusetts competitive, although I'm not sure really enough to move the needle on that. I really liked the career technology, career tech institutes, which really I think leverages our very strong vocational technical schools. I'm a little leery about the community college piece, simply because I'd like to see more of that moved into where it could be, into the voc tech schools, because our community colleges only have about a 21% completion rate. They are not real strong at this point, but we'll see. There certainly is plenty to like, I think, in there.
Phineas Baxandall, Mass Budget, has a more progressive take on this stuff. What does Mass Budget like in terms of what Healey had to say this week, and what do you think she missed or maybe got wrong?
Well, on the tax side, there is a lot to like. The biggest piece of it is this child and family tax credit, which would be $600 that even people who are already getting a refund would get as a check, and it's for any child under 13 as well as for dependent adults, a senior or a disabled adult living at home. And that's going to make a real difference for how affordable Massachusetts can be. What we didn't like in the tax package is there are these two really big cuts, very narrowly targeted just on the wealthiest. So the really deep estate tax cut, eliminating all taxes on estates from $1 million to $3 million, right. And then the biggest amount goes to estates that are over $3 million, actually get to fully collect $182,000 tax cut for anyone with that. And then there's also this tax cut for short-term capital gains.
From 12% down to
5%. Right. And that's chiefly things like, people who are flipping real estate, people who are doing more speculative financial types of transactions. It's only for these short-term investments, and it's really tightly concentrated. About 90% of it is the top 5%. So it's really, if we want to reduce the wealth gaps and the racial wealth gaps in this state, that is not the way to do it.
Lisa Kashinsky, I know you've been keeping tabs on different reactions from different sectors to Healey's tax plan and budget proposal. Has anything stood out to you in terms of who is happy about different pieces and who's unhappy?
Definitely. So two of the major areas of investment that the governor highlighted this week was in energy and environmental affairs, and also in education. And that set up this really interesting split screen between reactions from kind of those two areas of advocacy. People who advocate for, climate and energy and environmental, progress on combating climate change, they're thrilled by this. You have one of the state senators who sits and kind of leads these energy and environmental committees up on Beacon Hill. He said this was the best budget that he's seen to address these from the executive, because the governor is putting, 1% of the state budget towards energy and environmental agencies for the first time. The other big investment is in education that she's making, but that's where you start to see kind of a difference in reaction. Some education groups, they're cheering her for fully funding the Student Opportunity Act and things like that, but they're also worried about those those tax breaks that she's proposed, particularly the estate tax and slashing the short-term capital gains rate, as we've talked about. And they're basically worried about, they're calling them these quote unquote giveaways back to the wealthy, when that money they feel could be going towards more with education, especially with the governor taking a lot of the extra money from that's coming in through the millionaires tax and putting it towards early education and higher education, but not necessarily any extra money towards K-12 education.
Oh, that's interesting. Charlie Chieppo, I want to come back to the term competitiveness, which you mentioned a couple minutes ago, and talk a little more about what that actually means. It seems like it's the word of the moment right now. We heard Healey discuss it when she was rolling out the tax plan. She talked about it at the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce the other day. Here she is using it in her tax announcement. And Lynn, take a quick look.
We have to acknowledge that there are some aspects of our current tax system that make Massachusetts an outlier. When we don't keep up with other states, you see, we put our own competitiveness at risk.
So, Charlie, since you brought it up to begin with, how do you define competitiveness? And do you think that in balance or on balance, everything that Healey rolled out this week would in fact make Massachusetts more competitive?
Well, first, I want to thank the governor for the perfect lead-in to my comments. Look, here's what I think. This year, or in the last year, about half the states either have or are in the process of cutting taxes. And let me tell you, I am not like a cut taxes to zero kind of guy, but I mean, that is kind of the reality. And there is one state, Massachusetts, that has raised taxes.
With the millionaire's tax, right?
Right, yeah. and I think that one of the things that we have to look at in terms of competitiveness is, look, over 25 years, we lost $1 billion a year in adjusted gross income in Massachusetts in net out migration. From 2010 to 2020, that amount increased sixfold. So more than 70% of it is to New Hampshire and Florida. The most loss is in Middlesex County, which abuts New Hampshire. So I think that in that context of all those things, when you look at Massachusetts being only one of 12 states that even has an estate tax, and that we have the lowest threshold for an estate tax of the 12 that has it, Connecticut just raised their threshold to 12.3 million, which is the federal number. These are things we have to do. The same with the short-term capital gains. We have the highest short-term capital gains in the country, and I think that while certainly Phineas described part of what short-term capital gains tax is, there's a lot of people who aren't just looking to sort of make a buck and shaft people who are investing in Massachusetts in short-term capital gains. We have 110,000 people who have left Massachusetts just since the pandemic. We really have to take steps to try and keep people here and maintain this economy.
I think that embodies what you're talking about when you talk about competitiveness. Phineas, do you agree with that? I mean, do you accept that as a term of value and the definition that Charlie just laid out?
So I think competitiveness is a consideration, but I would describe it really differently than this. So Massachusetts has an issue with not enough workers here, right? That's, I think, something that's a pretty well accepted, that we have a problem with finding workers. Now, we have a problem finding workers not because rich people are fleeing our shores. We have a problem because people have trouble living a middle-class existence here. They can't live, they can't find housing that they can afford, or if they can find housing, it's not near schools that they believe in, or the commutes are too large. We have to make the investments on the public side to address this. Charlie was talking about vocational schools. There are these long wait lists for vocational schools. It costs at least $5,000 more per student per year year to educate someone in a good way in a vocational school. This costs money. It takes it on the spending side. So we need the investment money to do this. Giving $182,000 to somebody who's rich enough that they can decide where they want to live based on their quality of life is not the way to do it.
Okay. Lisa, there was a theory making the rounds last year after the legislature did not pass Governor Baker's tax cut proposals that maybe they wanted to hold off and cue Maura Healey, who was presumed, it was presumed she was going to be the next governor, cue her up for a big win early in her tenure. Have you seen or heard anything this week that gives credence to that theory? Or maybe does the opposite?
One of the factors last year was also Chapter 62F. I mean, do remember that there were tax relief proposals, that were in negotiations from the House and the Senate that had pieces of Governor Baker's and had proposed other things like one-time rebates. Those were very much nearing the finish line right when Chapter 62F kind of hit. And then House Speaker Ron Mariano at that point was the person who kind of became the stick in the mud, being like, we, don't know what's going to happen with the economy. We need to hold back. We're already giving $3 billion back to taxpayers.
I do remember that. What stands out as I think back on it is how that law seemed to surprise everyone except Governor Baker. It was like they didn't even know that this possibility was out there. But I interrupted you.
No, that's a good reminder. So now what we're seeing from Speaker Mariano is a little bit more willingness, it looks like, to play ball on tax relief. His response to the new governor's proposal was, there are some good things in it, some things that we have proposed before. There are some new things we have to look at. Overall, he seems more ready to move forward with it now that there's a clearer economic picture for the state heading into the new fiscal year. I will say, though, that one thing that is coming up this week is that basically with the end of the federal COVID emergencies that are happening, the state's going to have to take on more to kind of keep programs going that the feds had helped pay for, like rental assistance, childcare subsidies, that type of stuff. They'd expanded in the pandemic. The speaker is now starting to cast a little bit of doubt about what the state can really afford in that way. And it will be interesting to see how that factors into tax relief.
Yeah, that'll be fascinating to watch. Lisa Kashinsky, Charlie Chieppo, Phineas Baxandall, thank you all for talking this through. As we take a closer look at Governor Healey's political agenda over the coming weeks and months, we would like to hear what you think. Do her priorities line up with the issues that are top of mind for you? And what should she be focusing on in your view? You can let us know at gbh.org/Healey-agenda. That's it for tonight, but please do come back next week. And as always, tell us what you think. The email is talkingpolitics@wgbh.org. The website is gbhnews.org/talkingpolitics. Or you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Reilly Adam. For now, thanks for watching and good night.
The PBS NewsHour has